Hi, let's talk about the pharynx. So the pharynx has three major divisions. There's the nasopharynx, which is contiguous with the nasal cavity. There's the oropharynx, which is contiguous with the oral cavity. And then there's the laryngopharynx, which is contiguous with the larynx, as well as the esophagus. And all three of these parts are contiguous with one another, and together they form the aerodigestive pathway, or the routes by which air, foodstuffs, and beverages can make their way from the nasal and oral cavity down through to either the respiratory system or the digestive system. Now let's take a look at each of these divisions. In this particular session, we won't see a sagittally sectioned pharynx. We'll be looking at the pharynx from the posterior view, but I like this particular image here because it gives us an idea of how these spaces relate to one another. So let's start with the nasopharynx and work our way distally. So the border or boundary between the nasopharynx and the nasal cavity is known as the choana or the choanae. These are also known as the internal nares. Air would pass both directions. And when it passes through the choanae, it moves from the nasal cavity into the nasopharynx. Now, it's here that we can also see sometimes the opening for the pharyngotympanic tube. That would be a passageway that connects the nasopharynx with the middle ear, also known as the eustachian tube. So that's how we're able to equilibrate air pressure in our middle ear when we change altitudes or depths. We also have located here in the roof in younger individuals. You're not going to see this in our donor population, but there's a collection of lymphatic tissue known as the pharyngeal tonsil or the adenoid. It's a single midline mass that is the superior-most part of Waldeyer's ring. Now, the boundary between the nasopharynx and the oropharynx is the soft palate. So here's the bony palate. This is comprised of the maxilla here. Maybe there's even a little bit more of it right there. And then all of this here is soft palate. And the terminal portion of the soft palate is the uvula. Now, if we take a straight line from the soft palate backwards, not including the uvula, like so, that would be the boundary between nasopharynx and oropharynx. Because we include the uvula, and you can see the uvula if you open your mouth wide and look in a mirror. That hanging structure in the midline that's muscular, covered by mucosa, is your uvula. Anteriorly, the oral cavity is going to be separated by the from the oropharynx through a set of folds called the palatoglossal folds. These palatoglossal folds, when you consider them together, form the palatoglossal arch. If we move posteriorly, you'll see that there is a palatopharyngeal arch there. And the space between the two of these is known as the Falsies. So Falsies actually is Latin for throat, even though your throat is much more than just this part, but this is the anteriormost aspect of the oropharynx there. And I'm going to erase this so we can see some features here that I would like us to see. If we turn our attention to the tongue, this isn't really so much a learning objective in this session, but I think that it is very helpful to see. We can see these large circumvallate papillae, and these are going to be just adjacent to the terminal sulcus of the tongue. The tongue has really two parts. There's the presulcal and the postsulcal part of the tongue. That presulcal exists in the oral cavity. The postsulcal part of the tongue, or the posterior third of the tongue, resides within the oropharynx. And as we follow that, we can see that this rugose surface, or this rough and bumpy surface of the tongue, is comprised of the lingual tonsils, which we'll see a better view of in the posterior. Also kind of nestled here within the falsies is a tonsillar fossa for the palato, or the palatine tonsils. Have one on either side. So when people say that they're having their tonsils removed, very frequently they're referring to their palatine tonsils. If they have their adenoid removed, they're having their pharyngeal tonsil removed. And sometimes they'll have all of these removed together. Now, if we look inferiorly here, let's see, we can see there's the epiglottis descending down. Here's the margin of the epiglottis in the pharyngoepiglottic fold. So if we were to kind of draw a line along there, that's the border between the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, the boundary between those two. But before we get there, let's see, we can see a hyoid bone right there. And if we look, the tongue comes down, and there's a dip here, and the epiglottis comes down, and there's this trough. That trough there is known as the epiglottic vallecula. And there are two of these, the epiglottic valleculae. These are going to serve as little traps for saliva as saliva moves distally through the gastrointestinal tract. These valleculae, they allow you to build up saliva there so as not to cause a deglutition or swallowing reflex. And then when you're ready to swallow, the larynx is elevated, the epiglottic cartilage meets that, then the saliva can pass on its way down into the laryngopharynx and then eventually the esophagus down to the stomach. So let me erase some of this stuff so we can see some more of the features that we want to see. I'm terribly sorry, this particular specimen is a plastinated specimen, and so some of the passageways here aren't as patent as I would like them to be. In cross-section, though, here, I can see there would be an arytenoid cartilage. And so here is the laryngeal inlet. So that's the passageway of air between the laryngopharynx and the larynx, or the laryngeal cavity anteriorly. And as we move inferiorly, down, 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 as we go below the level of the cricoid cartilage, which is right there, that inferior margin of the cricoid cartilage, which is at about the 6th cervical vertebra level. As we pass that, the laryngopharynx is contiguous with the esophagus. So it's really in that laryngopharynx where materials have a decision to make whether they're moving anteriorly into the larynx or distally or inferiorly into the esophagus. And hopefully gases travel anteriorly, and foodstuffs and beverages travel along down into the esophagus. But sometimes that's not always the case, unfortunately. Now, here is a posterior view of the pharynx, and so the wall of the pharynx has been incised. We can see that there. And let's see what we can see. So here are the palatopharyngeal folds, right? Those palatopharyngeal folds are mucosa investing around those palatopharyngeus muscles, which are one of the three longitudinal muscles of the pharynx. Here's that uvula that we've been talking about, that hanging ball. And so here's the soft palate here. And so the line right about there to demarcate the nasopharynx from the oropharynx is there. And here we can see a good view of the choanae. There's one choana. And then there's the second choana. And we can see that the nasal septum in this region is largely comprised of both the vomer and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. Probably a little more vomer at this point, but we can see those choanae there and there. The pharyngeal tonsil would be anteriorly and high there, and then those pharyngotympanic tube openings would be lateral there. Now, as we move below the level of the soft palate, so just to draw the line there, we've got our uvula. I can also see the root of the tongue, so I'll just outline that here. That looks really nice and rugose. And so this is the root of the tongue with the lingual tonsil. The epiglottic valleculae would be behind the epiglottis here, and so they're heading down there and there. Let me spell that for you. Vallecula would be singular, valleculae is plural. And so with the epiglottis here, we have the boundary between the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. So let's continue on distally. So here's our lovely epiglottis, right? Here would be the interarytenoid notch. These arytenoid cartilages are approximated, so I'll just circle this here for the laryngeal inlet. So as materials move in or out of there, they're moving in or out of the larynx. The cricoid cartilage is about here, and this is invested in mucosa, so the arytenoids are approximately there. And then just lateral to the larynx, there and there, are the piriform recesses. So below the cricoid cartilage, we have the esophagus. And ideally, those food materials are coming from the oral cavity into the oropharynx through the Falsies and then down through the esophagus. But sometimes parts might end up in those piriform recesses, and they can feel uncomfortable. And that's not a good feeling for anyone. And it could put pressure on the larynx. It could affect the movement of these arytenoid cartilages, and that it's nothing that you want to experience. So we've talked a little bit about the pharynx and its various divisions, the naso, oro, and laryngopharynx, as well as the boundaries of these regions and their contents. Thank you for your time.